The city, still reeling from the grip of the German occupation, looked quiet, too quiet. The streets, cobbled and narrow, seemed like an unbroken expanse of emptiness. The hum of wartime routine, though present in the background, was muted under the weight of fear. But in the shadows of Lyon, within the cracked walls of old buildings, something was stirring. A man, hunched and slow, walked with purpose. His pace was measured, each step deliberate, yet there was an air of urgency to him that no one would ever expect. Georges Rivas, nearly 70, had no place on these streets. The young men had already gone to war. The strong and agile had either fought or fallen under the boots of the Nazis. Yet here he was, his body failing him with each passing day, his bones aching, but his mind sharper than ever. It was in these dark, silent moments of the occupation, where strength was measured not by force, but by the will to endure, that Georges found himself moving among the enemy. Rivas was not a soldier, nor was he a leader of any recognized movement. He had not fought in the trenches of World War I, nor did he have any formal military training. He was, for all intents and purposes, a civilian, a man who had lived through the horrors of the Great War only to be confronted by a new, even more insidious evil. Yet, it was precisely this lack of military pedigree that would come to serve him in ways the Germans could not anticipate. In a world dominated by the young and the strong, Georges had something more dangerous: wisdom, patience, and the experience of living through one war already. His greatest strength was his ability to move unnoticed, to remain invisible in a world where every face was watched and every gesture scrutinized. The occupation had been brutal, leaving the people of France caught between fear of the Nazis and resentment of the Vichy government, which had collaborated with the Germans. But in the corners of this despair, small flickers of resistance had begun to appear. It wasn't much: whispers in cafes, notes passed between strangers, hidden radios that broadcasted messages of hope. But it was enough. Enough to stir a feeling of rebellion in the hearts of those who refused to let their country be crushed under foreign boots. The resistance was not one unified force, but an amalgamation of isolated groups, operating in secrecy, each working toward the same goal: to sabotage the German war machine and, eventually, to rid their homeland of the invaders. But as much as the Germans were feared, the Vichy government was just as despised. They were traitors to their own people, their actions more dangerous than those of any foreign army. Georges Rivas was one of those individuals who refused to accept the new world. It was not so much that he had any deep political convictions. He had never thought of himself as a revolutionary, but rather it was a sense of moral outrage that had driven him to act. He could not sit idly by while the Nazis swept through his country, while the Gestapo tortured the innocent, while men, women, and children were carted off to concentration camps. He had lived long enough to know the horrors of war. But this occupation, this systematic attempt to erase the French spirit, was something he could not ignore. And so, he became part of the resistance, not as a fighter, but as an architect. He helped to organize, to strategize, to provide the framework that others would later build upon. But his was not the typical story of a war hero. Georges Rivas wasn't the kind of man who would storm the front lines, shouting defiance at the enemy. No, his approach was far subtler. He was an invisible man in a world that would soon learn to fear invisibility. He did not work in grand, sweeping gestures. Instead, he focused on the small, on the seemingly insignificant acts of sabotage that would slowly erode the German hold over the city. He understood that it wasn't always about big victories, about taking down entire battalions of soldiers or blowing up railway stations. Sometimes, the most effective form of resistance was simply making the enemy wonder if they could trust anyone, anywhere. The network he began to build was small at first, made up of individuals like himself, ordinary men and women whose lives had been upended by the war. A teacher here, a shopkeeper there, a former soldier who had been too old or too broken to continue the fight. They met in secret, in basements and back alleys, exchanging information, maps, and tools for their covert operations. Each act of sabotage was a tiny rebellion in itself. A damaged truck, a burned-out supply depot, a train that never made it to its destination. In a war where the enemy seemed all-powerful, these small victories were acts of defiance. They were the kind of victories that the Germans could not easily dismiss, because each one was a reminder that no matter how tightly they tried to control the country, there were still people willing to fight back. Yet, as Georges moved in and out of these underground meetings, he began to realize that his work was far more dangerous than he had initially understood. The enemy was watching, always watching. The Nazis, with their ever-present spies and informants, had a near-perfect system for crushing resistance before it could take root. Georges' age made him an unlikely suspect. No one would think that a man so old could be anything more than a relic of the past, someone too frail to pose a real threat. But the Germans were not so blind as to miss the growing whispers, the strange occurrences. And as the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. It wasn't enough to just be clever. Now, Georges needed to be careful. He could not afford to slip up. But Georges was, as he had always been, a man who moved with quiet purpose. He knew the streets of Lyon as well as his own backyard, and he used that knowledge to stay one step ahead of the enemy. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when he could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. He knew that every action he took, every decision he made, would have consequences, both for him and for the people he sought to protect. His resistance wasn't about self-glorification or heroism. It was about survival, about doing whatever was necessary to fight back, no matter the cost. The paradox of Georges Rivas was that, in the eyes of the world, he was an old man who had no reason to be on the front lines. And yet his very age gave him a power that the young, brash fighters could not possess. He had lived through enough to understand that the fight against tyranny wasn't just about the physical battlefield. It was about the mind, about outthinking the enemy, outlasting them. Georges' strength lay not in the force of his arms, but in the quiet strength of his resolve. The Germans may have had their guns, their tanks, their young soldiers with bright, eager eyes, but they didn't have the wisdom of years, the resilience of someone who had seen too much to ever surrender. And so he continued. Each day, each night, he moved in the shadows, setting up the next act of sabotage, coordinating with his network, and always watching, always waiting for the right moment. The city seemed to hold its breath as the tides of war slowly began to shift, but Georges knew the Germans were not the only ones who needed to be watched. The Vichy government, too, was a dangerous enemy, one that had to be dealt with carefully. As he moved between these worlds, between the Nazis and the collaborators, between the resistance and the oppressed, he began to realize just how alone he truly was. Even among his fellow resistance fighters, he remained a shadow. They saw him as a guide, a leader, but none of them knew him completely. He kept his past to himself, his motivations hidden behind the stoic mask of a man who had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to never reveal too much. But in these quiet moments of reflection, as the war raged on around him, Georges never lost sight of the bigger picture. He knew that it was not just about breaking the chains of occupation. It was about creating a future where people could live in freedom once more. His actions may have seemed small in the grand scheme of things, but he understood that every small crack in the enemy's facade, every fleeting moment of sabotage, was a step closer to that future. And so, he continued to fight. In the dark corners of Lyon, where no one saw him, Georges Rivas was changing the course of history, one small act at a time. As he walked through the streets, no one would ever know the truth of his story. He was not the hero they would remember, nor the figure they would place on a pedestal. But in the hearts of those who worked beside him, he was something much more powerful, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the spirit of resistance could never be truly extinguished. As the clock ticked forward, Georges Rivas's silent war was just beginning. But the question lingered. How long could the old man hold back the tide of history? And at what cost? The evening air in Vichy was thick with the quiet tension of a town caught between two forces. The constant hum of occupation seemed muffled, drowned by the weight of betrayal that hung in the streets. The Vichy government, though outwardly compliant, was a silent partner in the occupation, a fact that gnawed at the hearts of those who resisted in the shadows. But in the shadows, there was also hope. Small acts of defiance flickered in the dark corners of the town, igniting the belief that resistance was not just possible, but vital. And at the heart of this resistance, still moving like a ghost through the underworld of French defiance, was Georges Rivas. He was no longer working alone. Georges, the man who had once been a mere spectator to the fight, had transformed into a central figure in the underground network of saboteurs who had grown exponentially in size and ambition. He had always believed that resistance was born in the hearts of ordinary men and women. Now, it was his job to keep that heart beating, to nurture it in the most unlikely of places, the people who had no reason to fight but found themselves doing so anyway. He had become more than a coordinator. He was a symbol of quiet strength in a world that seemed devoid of it. And yet, as his network expanded, so too did the dangers they faced. The Nazis, relentless in their pursuit of any act of rebellion, were beginning to recognize the signs. A train here, a truck there, all left in ruins by acts of sabotage that seemed too well-timed to be mere coincidence. Georges knew that each strike was a victory, but it was also a risk. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere, and soon they would begin to realize that the old man they had overlooked was the architect of an invisible rebellion. The underground network that Georges had helped build was a strange creature, one that operated like a web of interconnected lives, each one vital to the others. It wasn't just about blowing up bridges or derailing trains. It was about feeding information, about moving people in and out of occupied territory undetected, about making the Nazis feel as though they were always one step behind. The resistance was becoming more organized, its tactics more sophisticated. What had started as a handful of rebels in the back rooms of bars and cafes had grown into a sprawling network that reached into every part of life in the occupied zone. The workers in the factories, the farmers in the fields, the teachers in the schools. Each one was a potential recruit, each one a cog in the ever-turning machine of defiance. Georges' role in all of this was subtle, yet pivotal. He was no longer just a man with a few ideas and a desire to resist. He was a leader, one whose experience and caution had made him the perfect person to run this web of subversion. He moved through the streets with an air of quiet authority, never rushing, always watching, listening for signs of danger or opportunity. Every conversation was a potential lead, every new face a possible ally or a threat. He trusted few, but he knew that trust was the currency of survival in this game. He had learned long ago that you couldn't fight a war with just guns and bombs. You needed something far more powerful: information. Knowledge was the true weapon in this fight, and Georges had become a master of wielding it. But even as he led, he felt the weight of his age pressing down on him. His bones ached more than they had before, and the quiet moments of solitude he used to enjoy now seemed like luxuries he could no longer afford. The network that he had helped build was only as strong as the people who made it up, and yet Georges knew that many of them were too young, too inexperienced to understand the depth of the danger they were in. They didn't know what it was like to lose everything, to be hunted down by men who had no mercy. To him, this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the soul of France itself. But the younger fighters, those who had never lived through the horrors of the First War, those who still had the fire of youth burning in their bellies, saw things differently. They were full of hope, full of ideals that Georges had once shared, but now saw with a more cynical eye. He admired their courage, but he also feared their impatience. The world they were fighting for was different from the world he had fought for, and he wondered if they truly understood the price of their actions. For the young fighters, the war was something they could win, if they just fought hard enough. But for Georges, this was no longer about victory in the traditional sense. It was about survival. And as much as he believed in the cause, he knew that each act of sabotage brought them one step closer to being discovered. It was only a matter of time before the Germans would find out who was behind the attacks. And when they did, there would be no mercy. The Gestapo would sweep through the streets like a plague, and no one, young or old, would be safe. But that was the risk they all took. The war was a game of chance, and each time Georges sent his fighters out into the streets, he was gambling with their lives. But the alternative, the acceptance of the occupation, was a far worse fate. To do nothing was to let the soul of France be crushed forever. The network was growing, yes, but so was the opposition. The Gestapo's grip on Vichy had tightened, and the once quiet streets were now crawling with spies and informants. Every corner, every alley, every building held the potential for danger. The French collaborators, who had been so quick to side with the Germans in exchange for power, were now actively working against the resistance, eager to root out anyone who dared to defy the occupation. Georges knew that the stakes were higher now than ever before. Every decision, every move had to be calculated, every contact carefully chosen. The resistance was no longer a shadow. It was becoming something real, something that could be destroyed if it wasn't careful. The more the network grew, the more Georges found himself slipping into a new role, one of constant vigilance. He had once been a quiet figure in the resistance, a man who worked behind the scenes, arranging meetings and sending out orders. But now he was the face of something much bigger. His actions, his decisions, would determine the future of this fight. And though he had never asked for this responsibility, he felt it on his shoulders every moment of every day. But the question that gnawed at him was not one of leadership. It was one of morality. What price would this war demand from him? What cost would his actions exact on those around him? The young fighters who followed him trusted him, even revered him. But Georges knew that trust could be a dangerous thing. He had seen too many good men, men he had once fought beside, fall to the pressure of war, fall to the betrayal of those they thought they could trust. And now, as the resistance network expanded, Georges found himself haunted by the same question that had always followed him. What happens when your fight for freedom turns against you? How long could one man hold back the tides of history, when every choice seemed to lead to more peril? The answer, he knew, was simple: not long. Every victory was fleeting, every moment of triumph could be shattered in an instant. But as long as there was breath in his body, as long as there was hope in his heart, Georges Rivas would fight. He would fight not for the recognition, not for the glory, but for the simple truth that freedom was worth any cost. With every attack, with every bomb, with every act of sabotage, the network he had built was becoming a force that the Nazis could not ignore. The Germans, in their arrogance, had believed they could control France through sheer force. But they had underestimated the resilience of its people, and they had underestimated the power of an old man who refused to surrender. For Georges, the battle was not yet won. But in the hearts of those who followed him, his actions were laying the groundwork for something far greater than any single victory. He was teaching them that resistance was not about grand gestures, but about small acts of defiance, done over and over again, until the enemy's strength began to crack.